Hello everyone, so I'm here today to talk about violent phenomena, and this is a collection of essays edited by Kavita Banot and Jeremy Tiang. And first of all, I was gifted this as part of the Santa exchange in Plek in Kieran's Discord server, and Owen gave me this, so very much thank you to Owen for gifting me this. I was very excited when I received the package. It's exactly my kind of thing. So this is a collection of 21 essays talking about translation and the different aspects of it, the different problematic things with it, basically, and it has a lot of perspectives. So it has a lot of people of color perspectives, so mostly Asians and African perspectives, but also some South American, especially Brazil, I think, and also it has a Welsh translator also in here. And I think each of the essays are kind of approach the assignment, if you will, a little bit differently, but they all have a common sense of colonialism and the colonizing translation, and that's one of the main topics that this tackles, the fact that translation by default tends to be a colonizing process because it's taking something from native people and giving it to the oppressor in a way that they can understand, and that very much talks specifically about translations that are done to target Western culture and Anglophonic English-speaking cultures. So it is often the case that when a text is translated, a lot of things are changed to fit the taste and the cultural background of English-speaking people, and that is something that is criticized over and over in this book. And there are a couple of times in particular that it's mentioned specifically that translation is often talked as a bridge between two cultures, and that has to change. That's not the case, because often these translators they exist in both cultures at the same time, and they are not a bridge. That vision is a very monolingual, monocultural view of seeing things. That actually there are many people that speak several languages at the same time and inhabit several realities and cultural realities at the same time. So talking about bridges between two, it excludes those people that live in both at the same time. Another point that was also touched upon in several of these essays is the fact that translations are never complete because they never have the whole picture, they never have the whole cultural background. They only mostly focus on the language, but the language carries culture, and how that culture is translated is really difficult to do. And also the fact that dialects exist. How do you translate dialects, right? And that brought me to the point in which, at least in Spain, when they translate all Western movies, they make the Native Americans in a way that they do not conjugate verbs, and in Spanish verbs are always conjugated. It's not like in English that you just add an s if it's third person singular. It's much more obvious than that, and they made them just Native Americans do not conjugate, and that's how they translated their dialects or their own language into Western movies. And of course that is very demeaning, because that sounds like they don't know how to speak the language, which is not true. So all those things are kind of complicated, and that's lost in translation, and it's often done in a way that is detrimental to the original country's language. The other big theme in this book is race. So it's also mentioned several times that most translators, especially to English, are white, and they are English or British or American, because there is this implicit assumption that someone of color does not speak the language perfectly and therefore cannot write a text in that language perfectly. So often translators of colors will have a co-translator that is basically an editor of their work. They don't speak the original language, they have no background in the original culture. They just make the edits of the translated text so that it's more palatable to English or US audiences. Even though these people that translate those books have a lot more experience translating, and they know much more about the culture they're translating from, and so they can give a lot more context in their translations, and somehow translate wordplays and things like that. And that was very shocking to me that they do that. It's just ridiculous in my opinion, but apparently that's something that happens quite often. And there was also one essay that was talking about the fact that we often talk about race and racism in the US context, even though some of these things do not happen in the US, and that is wrong because there is cultural baggage that is carried into racism that is different in different places. It doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have racism, for example, but it does mean that the baggage is different. Like there was a translator that was a woman of color, I think from the US, that was translated in Spain, and she noticed that a lot of the slur in Spain for black people is very connected to food, and that is not translatable into English, and the other way around. All the slurs it's not possible to translate those things. Another thing that I have noticed myself when we talk about race is that, again, it's very American centric. So it's like white people and black people and I don't know, Latino people or whatever. But in Europe, for example, it's much more complicated than that, because there is also grades within white people. Like Eastern European people are lesser considered, or Southern European people are often lesser considered, or there is also things like Irish people who speak Irish, or Welsh people who speak Welsh, or Spanish people who speak Basque or Catalan, or all these minority communities that are oppressed within the white people. And those things exist, and often also there is more oppression in terms of religion, for example, than in terms of the color of their skin. So if someone is Muslim, they will be maybe more oppressed than someone that is black but it's Dutch, for example. So there's a lot of interplay that does not happen within the discourse of the US, that is not translated, and it should be. And that's also why I really appreciated that they also had one essay from a Welsh translator, because even though obviously the experiences of colonialism within Europe are not as brutal as other parts of the world, it is still oppression that is nice to recognize, let's say. And there was, for example, I mentioned that there was one short story from a Catalan writer that was directly translated into Welsh, because their fights are similar. They are fighting from a place in which they are kind of colonized or oppressed by a bigger country, and it's the struggles that they face are very similar. And I thought that was very interesting. There was also another essay by an Indian woman that talked about a similar thing, but using the colonizers' language instead of as an oppression tool and as an empowerment tool. They take control over that. And she was talking about how, for example, translated something from one of the minority Indian languages into English, makes it accessible to many people in the world, including, for example, other people from other British colonies, like someone in Kenya that was oppressed and have similar experiences of oppression as the Indian people have, can now communicate in a language that they both speak. And the way the reason why they speak that language is obviously very violent and very negative, but it is a fact that they do speak those languages, and instead of denying that, they can use it for empowerment, and both things are okay. There was also a lot of talk about exclusion, about who gets translated. So, for example, in India, most of the translated texts from India are from the Brahmanian, so the upper caste, and not so much from the lower castes, and how translation could change that, but if it's done in a positive way. But also in terms of ableism, I didn't know this, but there is apparently a village in Indonesia in which the rate of deaf people is higher than average. Probably, I don't know, there is a recessive gene in that pool that repeats more than in other places or something, but there is a high number of deaf people in that village, and so that village has developed their own sign language, and of course you cannot translate that, you cannot really write that down in a page. If you do that, a lot of things are lost in between. So there is a certain ableist touch to the Western approach of translation should be in a book written down. Also in terms of the oral tradition of many cultures. And that's something that also Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book Decolonizing the Mind talks about a lot, that many people say that there is no traditional African literature because it's not written down, but the fact is that there are stories that are thousands of years old that exist from Africa. They are just told, they were never written, and those stories, if they are written, there's a lot that is lost in that translation, just from oral to written form. So there is a lot of more into that translation as well, that is very reductive to expect that everything can be put in a pretty book like this. And then there is also the directionality of things. So as I said before, it's there are certain assumptions in which who can translate what, and often the most common assumption is that someone should translate to their mother tongue, and that's why there are so many issues with translating into English, and why people that have a multicultural background are expected not to be proficient in English, so they are not hired as translator over a white person because they are accepted that it's not their mother tongue, even though they might have grown up in those cultures anyway. But yeah, there is that directionality, and that also doesn't always make sense, because assuming that any person that is native from a certain country is going to speak the language better than another person that maybe learned it a little bit later in life, it doesn't always make sense. And it's assuming it's also always then coming to translation from the English perspective or the majority language perspective, and they don't have all the context. If you have someone from that culture translate into English, they might, maybe, I don't know, have slightly different turn of phrase, but maybe that turn of phrase actually reveals the culture they're translated from much better, and it's much more representative of the actual text. So when someone says, oh, this translation was clunky because a certain sentence didn't flow as they are used to, maybe it's reflecting something from the original language that it's important to take into account, instead of just brushing those differences and make it more available and approachable for the English reader. Maybe that's not the point of the translator, and that's okay. But there is also the other way around, the directionality of how many English texts are, for example, translated to Welsh or to Tamil or to Tagalog or any of these smaller languages. Not so many, and that in part makes this text less accessible for those people, but also it's basically telling people who is more important than who. And there was this story about this Welsh publisher that published a book in English and the translator in Welsh at the same time. And the translation in Welsh was more powerful and more consumed, if you will, as the English than the English one, just because people wanted to see things in Welsh. But also there were people that just read both and see the differences in how things are interpreted, and I found that very interesting as well, that there is a certain power as well in reading in your own language, and that seems to be a given for English speakers, but it's not a given for other smaller languages, and it should be. And that is also why I like, for example, Charco Press, who translates from South American authors mainly into English, and it publishes in the UK, but they also often have the original book in Spanish published. So you can, for the same price, and it looks the same, you can get the original Spanish or the English translation. And I think that's very powerful as well, because it makes it more accessible to people that want to have that experience. And of course, Spanish is always a tricky language, I think, for me at least, because on one side, for me, Spanish is a European language, so it's a colonizer's language, but I also recognize that, for example, in the US, it's a minority language. It's the language of Latinos, and Latinos are oppressed, so when you speak Spanish in the US, you are thought of as lesser in the society, even though it's a colonizer's language. So those people that grew up in Latin America, and they had their mother tongues, the original languages like Nahuatl or like Quechua or whatever it is, and they were oppressed with Spanish, and then they go to the US and they are oppressed again because Spanish is not accepted there either. And to me, that's a little bit of a difficult thing to think about, because I think for Latinos in the US, Spanish is a prideful thing in a way that shows that they are Latinos. But for me, it's not a shameful way that they speak Spanish, but it's a difficult thing, because to me that represents all the colonizing power that was imposed into them, and all the harm that Spain, which is my native country, did in those countries. So yeah, that's something that, and it's not here, that's something that I just think about sometimes, that it's interesting. At least when I was in the US, I always found it really weird that people found weird that I spoke Spanish because I'm white. Anyway, other than that, there was also one essay here about how sometimes for the translation to make sense, they have to change the context of the whole book, basically. And again, the Welsh translator was saying that in one of the books that was translated from Welsh into English, they had to change the backstory to explain why the main character, which was saying different things about English people and how they felt about that, why they were writing in English if all those feelings were felt about the English people. And that also made me think about the TV series Scrubs, because in Scrubs, in the original one, which is American, there is this nurse that is Latina, so sometimes she speaks Spanish and nobody understands her, and that's kind of the joke. But obviously when they translate it to Spanish, that doesn't work, because if it's all in Spanish, of course everyone understands her. So they changed her into Italian, which I thought it made no sense. But they did that, and they didn't give her a backstory why she spoke Italian. And that kind of ruins the thing. Like, you understand why that was done, but it's also like it doesn't make sense. At least, I don't know, they could have chose Portuguese and she could be Brazilian. But yeah, so sometimes it is necessary to give a whole different backstory to the characters to make sense of a translation, and that's also very interesting to me. And then other minor things that they also talked about was the difficulty of translating from a gender language to a non-gender language, or vice versa, because sometimes, like, obviously people play with gender, especially a non-gender language like English. You can play with gender and the expectations of gender and stuff like that, but in a language that is gender like Spanish, you cannot do that. Like, if you say the doctor, in English could be both genders, in Spanish it cannot. You have to choose. You have different words for a male doctor and a female doctor, and you don't have a neutral one. So that's also really difficult to translate, I think. Those are some of the things that I found in this book. Also, there are a lot of mentions of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is one of my favorite authors, so that always makes me happy. And I think it does make sense, because he in his book Decolonizing the Mind, he wrote about a lot of these issues that are discussed here. So I think it makes complete sense that it's mentioned over and over again, because he wrote that a while ago, and I think it set the foundations for how to decolonize language and how to decolonize translation, which I think is really, really important, because we shouldn't have translations so that we can feel that, the setting is different, and like the food is different, so wow, it's so exotic, because that's colonialism. It has to be more radical than that. It has to be a political statement to have someone write something with their mother tongue first, and someone to translate it in a way that is true to the original culture and not the culture it is translated into. So yeah, I think it's very powerful. And even though I didn't agree completely with everything this book said, I think overall there are a lot of food for thought and a lot of interesting points to consider. And as I said, some essays contradict each other in some ways, which, yeah, it's I think it makes sense, because they are 21 different people, so they have 21 different opinions, and also some of them are more academic, some of them are more artistic with their essays. Things like this. And then some of them are really academic and have a lot of bibliography on them and stuff like that. So yeah, overall a very complete book, a very interesting topic, and a very interesting takes on it, and I will recommend. I know this was a very rambly review, and I'm sorry for that, but I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to talk about all the things I enjoyed about this book. So let me know if you want to pick it up now, or if you are interested in the topic, and until next video, bye.